President Trump has recently called for transferring election management to the federal government, which is typically run by state governments in the U.S. President Trump unexpectedly called for federal intervention, creating division within the Republican Party. Today we'll examine this issue. Let's begin. President Trump alleged fraud in the 2020 U.S. presidential election and called for centralizing federal elections. President Trump appeared on a conservative podcast hosted by former FBI Deputy Director Dan Bongino. He claimed illegal immigrants without voting rights are voting and said the Republican Party should respond more strongly. He also said that the 2020 presidential election was fraudulent. If you look closely at what he said at that time, President Trump said at the time that he won overwhelmingly and that people voted illegally. Naturally, President Trump's remarks caused an uproar across both parties. Chuck Schumer, the Democratic Senate Majority Leader, called the president's remarks on nationalizing elections illegal and absurd, pledging to oppose related bills. The Republican Party also faced internal backlash. John Thune, the Republican Senate Majority Leader, met with reporters on February 3rd and publicly stated that he does not support nationalizing the election. He said only U.S. citizens should vote and IDs should be required at polls, but stressed that President Trump's efforts to nationalize federal elections raise constitutional issues. And Mike Johnson, the Republican Speaker of the House, also stated that election management has always been the responsibility of the states, and in principle, he would not go against the spirit of the Constitution. The United States lacks a central election commission like South Korea's for national elections. The U.S. has always been careful to prevent the federal government from holding too much power, and the Constitution gives election authority to each state. In fact, according to Article 1 of the Constitution, the timing and manner of elections are, in principle, decided by the state legislatures and the overall administration of elections, from voter registration to voting methods, mail-in voting, and ballot counting procedures, falls under the authority of the state governments. Due to decentralization, nationwide election fraud would require manipulating systems in all 50 states and many counties simultaneously, which is extremely difficult. Senate Republican leader John Thune noted that hacking 50 systems is far harder than hacking one. In the end, the U.S. election system is structured in a decentralized way rather than being centralized, and it is evaluated as serving as a safeguard against abuse of power and large-scale manipulation. Suddenly, President Trump insists the federal government should manage these elections. A summary of U.S. media reports says most analysts believe President Trump has clear political motives for recently escalating his election remarks. President Trump has long claimed the 2020 presidential election was fraudulent. Recently, he has gone beyond simply refusing to accept the results and is now insisting that the entire election system should be changed at the federal government level. The American media sees this attitude shift as more than just a Trump outburst, but as the Republican Party reacting to a crisis after recent major election losses. In particular, the New York mayoral election in November 2025 and the special election for the 18th District of Texas for the U.S. House of Representatives on January 31st this year are being cited as decisive turning points. In American politics, these elections are viewed as a preview of the upcoming midterm elections rather than just local contests. The Republican Party is being evaluated as having received a shocking report card in that preview. In particular, the special election for Texas's 18th District is being regarded by the Republicans as a disaster, an emergency situation. Texas is considered the core base of the Republican Party and one of its strongest strongholds. It's unusual for the Democratic Party to win in this region, and a 14-point victory margin is even more surprising. Furthermore, considering that just a year ago, President Trump won a landslide victory in Texas by 17 percentage points, it means that there has been a public opinion shift of about 31 percentage points in just 1 year. If these results continue, pressure on President Trump to take responsibility will increase in the Republican Party. Because the Republican Party revolves around President Trump, repeated election losses could lead to criticism that moderate voters are leaving due to the Trump risk. For this reason, foreign media are analyzing that President Trump is pushing the election fraud narrative even more strongly to prevent the blame for his election defeat from being focused on himself. By claiming that the reason for losing the election is not a strategic failure or loss of public support, but because the election itself was rigged, he can avoid taking responsibility. This narrative also unites his supporters, as it lets them avoid accepting defeat and instead bond over a shared sense of victimhood. Some in American politics suggest President Trump may use election fraud claims as a strategy for the upcoming November midterms, not just to avoid responsibility. In the current situation, if President Trump loses in the midterm elections, there is a high possibility that the momentum of his administration so far will come to a halt, and the Democratic Party will likely oppose him. That's why there are observations that if President Trump continues to spread the election fraud narrative from now on, even if he loses in the midterm elections, he could try to frame it not as a judgment by the public, but as a problem with the election system in order to maintain his political leadership. There has actually been an incident that supports this trend. On January 28, the FBI raided the Fulton County Election Board in Georgia and seized records related to the 2020 presidential election. Fulton County is a Democratic stronghold in Georgia and was a major focus of Trump's post-election challenges. A major stir was caused when Tulsi Gabbard, Director of National Intelligence overseeing all U.S. intelligence agencies, personally appeared at the raid scene. The Director of National Intelligence oversees and coordinates all U.S. intelligence agencies, including the CIA and NSA. Some believe it's very unusual for such a person to be present during a raid on the Election Commission. A New York Times report said she had a speakerphone call with President Trump while with FBI agents at the scene. If this is true, the election investigation could inevitably appear to be directly connected to political power, and it is highly likely to lead to controversy over the political neutrality of the institutions that the United States has emphasized. In the end, the analysis that President Trump's increasingly strong remarks are linked to the recent accumulation of Republican election defeats, and the sense of political crisis ahead of the midterm elections is gaining traction. As the midterm elections approach, it is highly likely that the controversy over election fraud will intensify, and there are predictions that the division in American politics could deepen even further. Currently, President Trump's approval rating has dropped to its lowest point since the start of his second term. According to the American political media outlet The Hill, the British weekly The Economist, and the American polling agency YouGov, President Trump's approval rating among independent voters was only 27%. On the other hand, his disapproval rating was recorded at 67%. Looking at party supporters, among Republican supporters, President Trump's approval rating was 85% and his disapproval rating was 13%. Among Democratic supporters, his approval rating was 6% and his disapproval rating was 92%. In particular, The Hill analyzed that the recent shooting incident involving the Immigration Enforcement Committee likely had a significant impact on public opinion. However, there are certainly some interesting indicators as well. Despite President Trump's falling approval ratings, he has secured a record amount of political funds. According to a report by Politico, President Trump has secured $375 million, which is about 544.5 billion won in political funds. That's quite a significant amount. This amount is nearly 4 times the $95 million, or about 138.5 billion won held by the Republican National Committee. Such a scale is said to be unprecedented. President Trump is ahead of any other Republican candidate in raising funds from both wealthy donors and small contributors, according to Politico. President Trump can use these funds to exert influence in future elections. When President Trump talked about federal control of the election, many people picture the central government taking over the Election Commission. Since the United States lacks a central election commission like Korea, its system can be controlled differently. Even if the federal government can't directly run elections, it can use its agencies to influence election procedures and the overall environment. The main tool for this is the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice can launch major investigations into states or counties for alleged election law violations or voter fraud, and can also investigate election agencies or request documents. If these investigations expand, the affected area's election system may struggle to function, and nationwide distrust in election integrity could grow. The Department of Homeland Security also plays a key role, right? The Department of Homeland Security is responsible for responding to cyber attacks and protecting key infrastructure, and it can treat the security of the election system as a matter of national security. If the Department of Homeland Security warns of vulnerabilities in voting machines or databases and urges security upgrades or audits, this could pressure election officials and increase suspicion about results in some areas. Is it the same for the FBI and federal prosecutors? If the FBI conducts searches or investigations due to suspicions related to the election, and federal prosecutors begin indictment procedures, that alone can significantly undermine the trust in the local election management agencies. Especially if these actions coincide with President Trump's remarks, it creates the perception that the federal government is directly intervening, which could cause confusion throughout the entire election. If agencies like ICE or CBP are also involved, the effect is even greater. If the crackdown results are announced alongside the illegal immigrant voting claims pushed by the Trump camp, it could fuel election distrust, even without evidence. In the end, what President Trump refers to as federal intervention can be interpreted as a strategy not just to secure control over election operations, but to dominate the election environment and public opinion itself through federal agencies. President Trump continues discussing election fraud. What are your thoughts on the current situation in the US? Share in the comments. Thanks for watching.